Over the past month and a half, I've put out two convincing geopolitical videos that show that we are in a prelude to World War III. I'll put a link below so that you can see them. They're on my video content page on gregcaton.com. First one I put out, I believe, on April 25th. I did a follow-up on May 13th. Today is June 5th, and I'm doing an update because in the last week there has been a flurry of news items and leaks that are highly suggestive that the timeline to this event, to World War III becoming kinetic, that's where it gets brutal, gets violent, may well be within the next 2 to 3 months, in the August-September timeframe. So let's get started. Exhibit A for my video today is Mike Adams' announcement just yesterday in his June 4th broadcast that CCP planning major attack on USA this year. Bioweapons, cyber war, kamikaze drones, and infrastructure sabotage. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'll provide the link below, and if you have time, you can listen to Mike's 1 hour and 8-minute podcast, but here are some of the highlights. Mike opens with this. Over the last 48 hours, I've received a flood of intel from sources, both private and public, indicating that Communist China is moving up the timetable for a long-planned attack on the United States of America. In reality, the biological warfare phase of the attack is already underway, having begun in 2019 with the deliberate release of the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus, followed by direct interference in rigging the 2020 election and installing CCP puppet Joe Biden as a temporary occupant of the White House. Mike then goes on into other developments that highly suggest the timetable for a Russian invasion of the U.S. is being truncated. What we're looking at is the planned invasion of the United States. Are you surprised? At all? Even a little? Intel has been leaking out for well over 20 years that leaves no room for dispute that this has all been planned for well over a generation. I could pull out numerous examples from my personal library, but let's just examine 3 or 4. Now, in my first 2 videos on the subject of the prelude to World War III, I concentrated primarily on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and how Ukraine was acting as a proxy for U.S. And NATO interests. But I did make very clear that in my mind, World War III would primarily be a conflict that involved the combined forces of Russia and China against the United States. What I'm going to talk about now, that I really haven't covered previously because this is more germane to this particular video, is what's happening with China. I've been knowing about it for a long time. I first became aware of this, or kind of hit on my radar screen, with the introduction of a book by a man named, actually he's an independent journalist named Scott Gulbranson, and it's called The Silent Invasion. And it wasn't just the book that I read. I actually heard some interviews by this journalist, and here are the main points. That there was a lot, and this is going back 20 years. This book was published, I think for the first print was in 2003, but it has to do with events that he had been picking up on since 2000, that large amounts of material, weaponry were coming across the border, personnel, and when people who worked for border control called their superiors in Washington because they thought that this is something that was chargeable or that people could be arrested for doing this, were told back off. Okay, that Chinese weaponry was crossing the border even as far ago as 20 years. And he goes into great length about just how shocking it is. And that's why he entitles the book The Silent Invasion. Because the fact that nobody was talking about it, and this is 20 years ago. Then we have this little gem, The China Threat, How the People's Republic Targets America, by Bill Gertz. This was published in 2000, and I read it, I think, actually in 2003, but he makes it very clear that everything is for sale in Washington, D.C. The people that are in Washington would sell out their own mother if it would get them ahead in their career. I mean, you have the most unconscionably people with no moral background whatsoever who occupy the halls of Washington, D.C. And he gets into that. And the reason that that book is important is because it gives you an idea as to the foundation of how we could reach a point where all this could be going on, and politically, your politicians are actually planning your demise, because they will do that if somehow it will line their own pockets. The next thing I want to bring to your attention is a book by Stephen Mosher called Hegemon: China's Plan to Dominate Asia and the World. Okay? I think I read this later, I think in 2005. But, it's important to kind of understand the history of a people so that you know why they're behaving the way they do. For millennia, the Chinese definition, or among the Chinese elite, the definition of barbarian was someone who wasn't from China. Okay? And in their view, Americans are just trash that should be put in labor camps. And of course, those already exist. Of course, you don't know about it. You don't know we had slave labor in the United States, didn't you? You didn't know that the United States was driven by slave labor. It's called Unicor. They're in the federal prison system. These guys work for 10 cents an hour. Okay? So when they invade the United States and bomb the living hell out of it and meet the Deagle.com number of reducing the U.S. population for 2025 from 330 million down to anywhere between 65 and 99 million. And the rest of you will end up in some version of Unicor camp working for 10 cents an hour. That's what they got planned. I know that you don't want to believe this. I know that you don't think it's possible. But that's how hegemons work. That's how they... This is reinforced by a book by Jasper Becker. I don't think I got around to this one until 2009. It's called The Chinese, an insider's look at the issues which affect and shape China today. But it really reinforces the others. So why am I bringing these various works up that I've read over the last 20 years? The reason is because what you're seeing play out right now, just like COVID, has been on the drawing board for a long, long time. And I have to honestly say there's nothing that is going on right now that I didn't know would eventually happen. I just didn't know when. Okay, there's one other little tidbit that I want to point out in Mike Adams' article. Let's go over this one together. I think it's kind of important. As reported by the Epoch Times, Kyle Bass has also warned of the 130,000-acre parcel of land in southwest Texas that is now owned by the same Chinese billionaire who owns 2/3 of the land in China's Xinjiang region, where slave labor concentration camps are in full operation, right? Just like the Unicor operation, slave labor operation we have here in the United States. The land for the wind farm is owned by a Chinese company called GH America Investments Group, which has since 2015 bought 130,000 acres of land, an area the size of Tulsa, Oklahoma, in Valverde County. The man behind the firm in Sun Yingjin's is Sun Guanjin, a businessman from northwestern Xinjiang region in China who has strong ties to the communist regime. Sun, a former military officer, is currently the richest person in Xinjiang, where the regime is committing genocide against ethnic Muslim minorities. He also has a net worth of $1.9 billion, according to Forbes, and was also the vice chairman of the Xinjiang Provincial Youth Federation. Okay, let's stop for a minute. Let's put it on pause. Why is this important? Do you think that people who are at the forefront, at the vanguard of this planned attack in America, do you think they're going to treat Americans better than they treat their own people or ethnic Muslim minorities who have lived in China for generations? Do you think Americans are going to get special treatment? Do you? Okay, anyways, that's it for Mike's article, and I encourage you to read it. Let's talk about other sources for this coming event. Yesterday, Dave Hodges put out the following piece on his website, thecommonsenseshow.com. It's entitled, China and U.S. Move Dramatically Closer to War. It's a 5-minute video, but it puts out the same information. He too quotes major Chinese publications. Let's focus on 2 of those comments that are coming out in the Chinese media. 1, we've already conquered America. 2, we're just waiting for them to die. Okay? We've already conquered America. We're just waiting for them to die. Waiting for them to die. Let me think now. Waiting for them to die. Do you think their people are taking the real mRNA vaccine? Yes or no? You get 3 guesses, and the first 2 don't count. Before COVID, the military intel website, Deagle.com, showed the 2025 U.S. population figure of 65 million, down from 328 million. That means 70% of all U.S. citizens have to die. Okay? Dave Hodges is also reporting from his contacts that leave and liberty is being curtailed throughout the U.S. military, so they're preparing for something big. Boy, I'll say. So, tell you what, let's go over to what does it mean. There's too many articles on the same theme. Each and every one of them are just astonishing. So let's cover the one from June 3rd, just 2 days ago. Here we go. Spiral of confrontation worse than Cuban Missile Crisis erupts as Trump plots August return to power. Okay, well, first of all, there's a lot of things that are to be recommended from this article, but the idea that Trump is returning to power isn't one of them. That's just more distraction. It's like these Q people I have to contend with who will tell me things like, oh, did you know that Hillary Clinton went to Gitmo and it was executed? And then when she resurfaces, I say, well, have you seen her on such and such? And they'll say, well, then that has to be a body double. I mean, people need to wake up. Enough Q, enough of this stuff that Trump is going to be a savior. Trump's not a savior. He's the one that initiated Operation Warp Speed to accelerate the program for people to get vaccinated in the first place. Okay, I'm tired of all this savior talk about Trump. Okay, enough. I mean, he isn't leading people down the dark path that Joe Biden is, but then Joe Biden is a puppet of something even worse. So let's let that one go. Okay, so now what I want to talk about is I want to talk about people who have had amazing visions. Like myself, I talk about this extensively in my book, The Gospel of 2012 According to Ayahuasca, that what appears to be on the horizon has been astonishingly predicted by previous individuals who at least had a following among those who said, you know, this person is pretty accurate in what they're seeing. And after a while, they develop a track record, and then people believe in the future events that they talk about. There's a man named Dumitru Duduman, who had visions and was shown submarines on both the east and west coast of the United States, Russian submarines just opening up the doors and just firing volleys of nuclear weapons all over the United States. Now then you got another guy named Henry Gruber, who said, you'll know the war begins when Israel sends troops into Gaza. It will be a sign the Middle East war has started. Well, that's really arguing in World War III. Well, when did that happen? Well, it's all past tense. It happened on May 13th. Happened less than a month ago. And this is something that this guy was told 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I can't remember the exact date, when Henry Gruber was first showing this, but pretty astonishing in my opinion. You got another guy out there too. His name's David Wilkerson, and he also just saw horrific military confrontation fire all over, particularly New York City. It'd be completely leveled. So, you know, there are people who have had intimations of these things psychically, as have I, and I published what I saw. Few people read it, but I did publish it. So, obviously no one but the architects of World War III know exactly when the meat of this event gets kicked off. But I wouldn't let it catch you by surprise. I wouldn't. You need to finalize whatever preparations you feel are necessary, physically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. And I wouldn't put it off. Because give or take a month or two, we don't have much time left.
I have also discussed in recent videos the growing self-confidence exhilaration, if you prefer, buoyancy almost, that the Chinese are bringing to their conduct of diplomacy. They are showing increasing signs that they are in the ascendant and feel themselves to be so, and that they have the United States and the West essentially on the run. I think that this is explained by three factors. Firstly, there is obviously that enormous growth of Chinese power which we have witnessed over the last 30 years. This is underpinned by the enormous expansion of the Chinese economy. It is now the biggest manufacturing economy in the world by far. It has the biggest GDP by purchasing power parity terms. It is likely to surpass the US in nominal GDP by the end of this decade, and probably by 2028, which is only 7 years away. It is the biggest trader in hard goods, manufactured goods and raw materials, having overtaken the US in that capacity back in 2013.